Emma Rodriguez clutched her daughter's hand tightly as they walked through the sliding doors of Henderson's Fine Dining, the most upscale restaurant in downtown Portland. At 7 years old, little Sophia had never seen anything like this place. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Pristine white tablecloths adorned every surface, and the soft murmur of well-dressed patrons created an atmosphere of refined elegance. Emma's son Marcus, barely 5, pressed close to her other side, his wide eyes taking in the grandeur that seemed worlds away from their cramped studio apartment. Emma had been working 3 jobs for the past 6 months, ever since her husband David had walked out without warning, leaving behind only mounting debts and 2 confused children who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. The divorce papers had arrived 2 weeks later, along with the crushing realization that David had emptied their joint savings account before disappearing. Now, Emma worked as a night janitor at an office building, a morning shift at a coffee shop, and weekends at a local grocery store, barely managing to keep their heads above water. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was supposed to be special. It was Sophia's birthday, and despite having only $43 in her checking account, Emma had decided her daughter deserved to feel like a princess for one evening. She had called ahead, asking about the children's menu prices, and calculated that she could afford 2 kids' meals and maybe a side salad for herself. It would mean eating instant noodles for the rest of the week, but seeing the excitement in her children's faces made every sacrifice worthwhile. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile, looked them up and down with barely concealed disdain. Emma was acutely aware of their appearance. Her own dress was a thrift store find that she had carefully mended and pressed, while the children wore their church clothes, clean but obviously inexpensive. Marcus's shoes had a small scuff mark that no amount of polishing could completely hide, and Sophia's dress, though beautiful to Emma, was clearly from a discount retailer. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "No, but I called earlier and was told you might have space for a table for 3," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. The hostess glanced toward the dining room, where Emma could see several empty tables, then back at them with an expression that had shifted from professional courtesy to something closer to annoyance. "I'm sorry, but we're completely booked tonight. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the family restaurants down the street." Emma felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but it was Sophia's disappointed face that broke her heart. Her daughter had been talking about this dinner for days, had even practiced using fancy manners at their small kitchen table. Marcus, sensing the tension, had gone quiet and was tugging at Emma's skirt. "Please," Emma said quietly, "it's my daughter's birthday. I can pay for our meals. I just want to give her one special evening." The hostess's expression didn't soften. If anything, it became more pointed, her gaze lingering on Emma's worn purse and the children's modest clothing with obvious judgment. The assistant manager, Richard Blackwood, appeared at the hostess stand as if summoned by some invisible signal. He was a tall man in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of authority in upscale establishments. His tailored suit probably cost more than Emma made in 2 months, and his cold blue eyes assessed their little family with the same calculating look a jeweler might give a piece of costume jewelry. "Is there a problem here?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided there was. "This woman wants a table, but she doesn't have a reservation," the hostess explained, her voice carrying just enough emphasis to convey her disapproval of Emma's presence. Richard's gaze moved from Emma to the children, lingering on Marcus's scuffed shoes and Sophia's discount store dress. Emma watched as his expression shifted from professional indifference to something approaching disgust, as if their very presence was somehow contaminating his pristine establishment. "Ma'am, Henderson's fine dining maintains certain standards," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We cater to a specific clientele who expect a particular dining experience. I'm sure you understand that families with small children might be more comfortable at establishments better suited to their needs." Emma felt the familiar sting of being judged for her circumstances, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but my children are well behaved. This is my daughter's birthday, and I just want to give her a nice dinner. I can afford to pay for our meals." Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. "I'm sure you think you can, but our entrees start at $60. Our children's meals are $35 each. Are you quite certain you're prepared for that level of expense?" The number hit Emma like a physical blow. She had researched their prices online, but apparently the website hadn't been updated. Still, she reached into her purse with trembling fingers, counting the bills she had so carefully saved. She had enough for one child's meal, maybe two if she skipped eating entirely. Sophia tugged at her mother's dress. "Mommy, what's wrong? Can't we eat here?" The innocence in her daughter's voice nearly broke Emma's resolve, but it was Marcus who spoke next, his small voice barely above a whisper. "Are we too poor, Mommy?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Emma saw Richard's smirk deepen. Other diners had begun to notice the commotion, their conversations quieting as they turned to watch the spectacle of a struggling mother being turned away from their exclusive establishment. "Listen," Richard said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Why don't you take your children to McDonald's where they belong? This isn't a charity kitchen." Emma felt her world tilt on its axis. The humiliation was complete and devastating, but it was the tears starting to form in Sophia's eyes that finally broke something inside her. This man had just crushed her daughter's birthday dreams with the casual cruelty of someone who had never known what it meant to count every dollar, to choose between groceries and electricity, to love someone so much that you'd sacrifice everything just to see them smile. At 32 years old, Emma Rodriguez had endured her husband's abandonment, worked herself to exhaustion, and swallowed her pride more times than she could count. But watching this entitled man mock her children's poverty in front of a room full of strangers was the moment she decided that some humiliations demanded an answer. "You're right," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "We don't belong here tonight. But I want you to remember this moment, Mr. Blackwood. Remember it well." Something in her tone must have caught Richard's attention because his smirk faltered slightly. Emma gathered her children close, kissed Sophia's forehead, and whispered that they would celebrate her birthday somewhere even better. As they walked toward the exit, Emma's mind was already working, already planning. She had been poor all her life, but she had also been underestimated all her life. And Richard Blackwood had just made the mistake of humiliating a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and two children who deserved better than the world they had been given. Emma Rodriguez was about to teach Henderson's fine dining what happened when you broke a mother's heart on her daughter's birthday. The lesson would be thorough, it would be devastating, and it would be absolutely unforgettable. Outside in the parking lot, Emma knelt down to her children's level, wiping away their tears and forcing a smile she didn't feel. "You know what? That man just did us a favor. We're going to have an adventure instead, something much more fun than sitting in that stuffy old restaurant." She drove them to a 24-hour diner where the waitress remembered their names, where Sophia could get pancakes with extra whipped cream, and where nobody cared that their clothes came from thrift stores. As her children laughed and ate their birthday dinner, Emma excused herself to use the restroom and made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to her sister Maria, who worked in commercial real estate. The second was to her college roommate Janet, who had become a successful food blogger with over 2 million followers. The third was to her cousin Carlos, who owned a construction company and had been looking for ways to expand his business. By the time they finished dinner, Emma had the beginnings of a plan that would turn Richard Blackwood's moment of cruelty into the biggest mistake of his professional life. She had spent years being stepped on, overlooked, and dismissed. But Emma Rodriguez was about to remind the world that the most dangerous person you can humiliate is someone who has already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. The next morning, Emma called in sick to her coffee shop job for the first time in 8 months. Instead, She spent the day in the Portland Public Library, researching everything she could find about Henderson's fine dining, Richard Blackwood, and the restaurant's owner, Gerald Henderson. What she discovered was more than she had hoped for and worse than she had imagined. Henderson's fine dining had been struggling financially for over a year, hemorrhaging money despite its upscale reputation. The restaurant had received multiple health code violations in the past 6 months, all of which had been quietly settled without public disclosure. More interesting still, Gerald Henderson was desperately seeking investors to keep the business afloat, which meant reputation was everything. Emma also learned that Richard Blackwood had a history of similar incidents. Online reviews mentioned his condescending treatment of customers he deemed inappropriate for the establishment, but these complaints had been carefully managed and suppressed. The man who had humiliated her family had made a career of making people feel small, using his position of authority to inflict casual cruelty on those he considered beneath him. But Emma's research revealed something else entirely, something that made her smile for the first time since walking out of that restaurant. Henderson's Fine Dining had submitted an application to be featured in Portland's prestigious Golden Fork Awards, an annual competition that could make or break high-end restaurants. The judging process was secretive, with anonymous critics visiting establishments over a 3-month period. Emma closed her laptop and walked to the children's section of the library, where Sophia was reading quietly while Marcus colored in a workbook. Looking at her daughter's face, still shadowed by the disappointment of the previous evening, Emma felt her resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. Richard Blackwood had wanted to teach her family a lesson about knowing their place. Now, Emma Rodriguez was going to teach him something about consequences, about the power of a mother's love, and about what happened when you underestimated someone simply because they had less money in their bank account. The war was about to begin, and Emma intended to win it in a way that would leave Henderson's Fine Dining questioning everything they thought they knew about customer service, basic human decency, and the woman they had so carelessly dismissed as unworthy of their time. That afternoon, Emma made another call, this one to her former supervisor at the corporate cleaning company, where she had worked before taking on multiple part-time jobs. Margaret Chen had always liked Emma's work ethic and attention to detail, and when Emma explained what she needed, Margaret was more than willing to help. "You want to work the Hendersons' fine dining contract?" Margaret asked. "Emma, that's our most demanding client. They want their floors spotless, every surface sanitized, and they're incredibly particular about timing. The work has to be done between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when they're closed." "I can handle it," Emma said firmly. "And Margaret, I need you to know that I might be asking for some special accommodations over the next few weeks." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Emma, you're not planning anything that could get us in trouble, are you? Nothing illegal, Emma replied, which was technically true. I just need access to do my job properly. Can you trust me on this? Margaret sighed, but Emma could hear the sympathy in her voice. After what you've told me about how they treated you and your kids, I'm inclined to give you whatever support you need. When can you start? Tonight. Emma's first night cleaning Henderson's fine dining was reconnaissance disguised as work. As she mopped floors and wiped down surfaces, she memorized the layout, noted the locations of security cameras, and observed the patterns of the overnight staff. More importantly, she took photographs of everything with her phone: the kitchen conditions, the storage areas, and several questionable practices that would make any health inspector very interested. She also planted the first seeds of her campaign. In the staff break room, she left behind a small notebook, seemingly forgotten, with the name and phone number of Janet Morrison, food blogger and social media influencer. To anyone who found it, it would appear that a famous food critic had been taking notes about the restaurant. Over the next week, Emma's plan began to unfold with military precision. Her sister Maria casually mentioned to several commercial real estate contacts that Henderson's fine dining was secretly looking for new investors, suggesting financial instability. Her cousin Carlos started parking his construction trucks near the restaurant during peak dinner hours, creating the impression that major renovations were planned. Meanwhile, Emma continued her night shifts, gathering intelligence and planting more evidence of the mysterious food critic's presence. She left behind receipts from other high-end restaurants with notes scribbled on them, dropped a business card for a food photography service near the hostess stand, and even went so far as to stage a forgotten earring in the women's restroom. An expensive-looking piece that would convince staff that someone important had been dining there unrecognized. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. Emma could see the tension building among the staff as rumors spread about a secret critic evaluating them for the Golden Fork Awards. Richard Blackwood had become increasingly paranoid, scrutinizing every customer and demanding perfection from his servers. But Emma's masterpiece was yet to come, and it would require a performance worthy of an Oscar. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner incident, Emma walked into Henderson's fine dining again. This time, however, she looked nothing like the struggling mother who had been turned away in humiliation. Her sister Maria had lent her an expensive designer dress. Her cousin's wife had done her makeup and hair at a professional salon, and Emma carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to the finer things in life. The transformation was so complete that the hostess didn't recognize her at all. "Good evening. Welcome to Henderson's fine dining. Do you have a reservation?" "Janet Morrison," Emma said smoothly, using her friend's name with practiced ease. I believe you have a table for me." The hostess's eyes widened slightly. Janet Morrison was a name that carried weight in Portland's restaurant scene, and Emma watched as the young woman's demeanor shifted instantly to one of eager accommodation. "Of course, Ms. Morrison. Mr. Blackwood specifically asked to be notified when you arrived. Please, right this way." Emma was led to the best table in the house, the same dining room where she had been humiliated 3 weeks earlier. She could see Richard Blackwood approaching from across the room, his face arranged in an expression of obsequious welcome that made her stomach turn. "Ms. Morrison," Richard said, extending his hand with a smile that Emma recognized as utterly false. "What an honor to have you dining with us tonight. I trust everything will be to your satisfaction." Emma shook his hand, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had mocked her children's poverty and crushed her daughter's birthday dreams. He showed no recognition whatsoever, seeing only what he expected to see: a wealthy, influential woman whose opinion could make or break his restaurant. "I certainly hope so," Emma replied, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Richard's smile grow even wider. "I've heard such interesting things about Henderson's fine dining." What Richard Blackwood didn't know was that Emma had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this moment, with the dedication of a method actor preparing for the role of her lifetime. She had studied food terminology, restaurant etiquette, and the subtle art of critique that could destroy a career with a few well-chosen words. Tonight, she would give him exactly what he had given her family: a performance so devastating that it would leave scars that never fully healed. As Emma settled into her chair and accepted the leather-bound menu, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The man who had taught her children that they weren't good enough for his establishment was about to learn what it felt like to be judged, dismissed, and found wanting. The lesson was about to begin, and Emma Rodriguez intended to be a very thorough teacher. Richard Blackwood hovered near Emma's table with the anxious attention of a man whose career hung in the balance. Emma could see the sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the restaurant's careful climate control, and she savored every moment of his discomfort. This was the same man who had publicly humiliated her family, who had sent her children home in tears, who had treated their poverty as a personal insult to his precious establishment. "Our sommelier has selected some exceptional wines for tonight," Richard said, gesturing to a server who appeared immediately with a wine list. "Perhaps you'd like to start with our 2018 Burgundy. It's been getting remarkable reviews." Emma accepted the wine list with practiced grace, running her finger down the selections as if she were intimately familiar with each vintage. In reality, she had spent hours online learning about wine terminology and pricing, understanding that knowledge was power in this particular battlefield. She murmured, loud enough for Richard to hear. Your wine list is rather limited, isn't it? I was hoping to see some of the newer Oregon vintages. The 2019 Archery Summit, perhaps, or the 2020 Sakal Blosser Reserve. Emma watched as Richard's face went pale. She had named two wines that were both highly regarded and extremely expensive, wines that Henderson's fine dining couldn't afford to stock given their financial struggles. His attempt to recover was painful to watch. Of course, we focus on classical selections rather than following every trend, Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. But I'm certain we can accommodate your preferences. Let me speak with our sommelier about our reserve collection. Emma waved her hand dismissively. Don't trouble yourself. I'll have the Burgundy you recommended. She paused, letting him relax slightly before delivering her next blow. Though I must say, presentation is so important, don't you think? The little details that separate a good restaurant from a truly exceptional one. Absolutely, Richard agreed eagerly, though Emma could see the confusion in his eyes. Emma opened her purse and withdrew a small notebook, exactly like the one she had been planting around the restaurant for weeks. Richard's eyes fixed on it with the intensity of a man watching his execution being prepared. I do hope you don't mind, Emma said sweetly, but I always take a few notes during my dining experiences. It helps me remember the nuances when I'm writing my reviews. The word reviews hit Richard like a physical blow. Emma could practically see his mind racing, calculating how much damage a negative review from Janet Morrison could do to their already precarious reputation. Of course, Richard stammered. Please, whatever you need to make your experience memorable. Emma smiled, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, it was completely genuine. Oh, I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, this evening will be absolutely unforgettable. As the dinner progressed, Emma subjected Richard to a master class in psychological warfare disguised as food criticism. She asked pointed questions about ingredient sourcing, kitchen hygiene standards, and staff training protocols. Each inquiry was delivered with the casual authority of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about, and each question hit one of the restaurant's known weaknesses. When her entree arrived, a perfectly prepared filet mignon that cost more than Emma typically spent on groceries in a week, she examined it with the intense scrutiny of a scientist studying a specimen. She photographed it from multiple angles, made notes in her notebook, and asked to speak with the chef about his preparation methods. The plating is quite lovely, Emma told the nervous chef when he appeared at her table. Though I'm curious about your beef sourcing. Local ranches, I assume. The chef, a young man named David who looked like he was about to faint, stammered through an explanation about their meat suppliers. Emma nodded thoughtfully, making more notes that she was careful to shield from his view. "Interesting approach," she said finally. "Very traditional." In the world of high-end restaurant criticism, traditional was often code for boring or unimaginative, and Emma could see that both the chef and Richard understood the implication perfectly. The evening continued with Emma systematically dismantling every aspect of the dining experience with the precision of a surgeon. She critiqued the spacing between courses, questioned the temperature of her wine, and expressed subtle disappointment with the bread service. Each comment was delivered with such professional authority that Richard's desperation became increasingly obvious to the entire staff. But Emma's true masterstroke came as she was finishing her dessert, a elaborate chocolate creation that would have been the highlight of any normal dining experience. Richard approached her table one final time, his smile now looking more like a grimace. "I do hope everything has been satisfactory, Ms. Morrison. Is there anything else we can do to enhance your evening?" Emma set down her fork and looked directly into his eyes, seeing the same arrogance that had dismissed her family weeks earlier, now tempered by fear and desperation. "Actually, yes," Emma said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Richard lean forward eagerly. "I'm curious about your customer service philosophy. How do you handle situations where potential diners might not meet your typical clientele standards?" The question was a trap, and Emma could see Richard's mind racing as he tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't incriminate him. "We pride ourselves on treating every guest with the utmost respect," Richard said carefully. "Henderson's fine dining welcomes anyone who appreciates exceptional cuisine and service." Emma smiled, and this time there was nothing sweet about it. "How wonderful," she said, opening her notebook to a fresh page. "Because I recently heard the most disturbing story about a mother who was turned away from your establishment on her daughter's birthday. Apparently, your staff suggested she take her children to McDonald's instead, simply because they weren't dressed expensively enough." Richard's face went through several color changes, finally settling on a sickly gray that matched his suddenly clammy complexion. I'm not sure what you might have heard, but that certainly doesn't sound like something that would happen here," Richard managed to say, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Emma leaned back in her chair, studying him with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. "No, how strange." The story was quite specific. A 7-year-old girl named Sophia, I believe, and her 5-year-old brother Marcus. Their mother had saved money for weeks to give her daughter a special birthday dinner, only to be told by someone in management that they belonged at McDonald's because they weren't wealthy enough for this establishment. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Emma could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes, when he realized that the expensively dressed woman sitting before him was the same person he had humiliated with such casual cruelty. "It's you," he whispered, the word barely audible. Emma Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time in 3 weeks she felt truly, completely satisfied. "Me," she confirmed, her voice carrying all the authority and confidence she had never been allowed to show during their first encounter. "Emma Rodriguez, the woman whose children you decided weren't good enough for your restaurant. The mother whose daughter spent her birthday crying because a man in an expensive suit told her she belonged at McDonald's." Richard's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into the empty chair across from Emma's table, without invitation. The color had completely drained from his face, and Emma could see his hands trembling as the full implications of the situation became clear to him. "The wine you recommended was excellent, by the way," Emma continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than his complete and utter professional destruction. "Particularly impressive considering your establishment's reported financial difficulties. I imagine every bottle counts when you're hemorrhaging money the way Henderson's fine dining apparently has been." "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice cracking with desperation. Emma laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "What do I want? 3 weeks ago, all I wanted was to give my daughter a birthday dinner she would remember. You decided she wasn't worthy of that simple happiness. So now, Mr. Blackwood, I want to give you something you'll remember for the rest of your career." She stood up, gathering her purse and notebook with movements so deliberate and controlled that they seemed choreographed. Every eye in the restaurant was now focused on their table, drawn by the palpable tension and Richard's obvious distress. "You see," Emma continued, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room, "I'm not actually Janet Morrison, though I'm sure she'll be fascinated to hear about tonight's experience when I call her tomorrow. Janet is a very dear friend of mine, and she has over 2 million followers who trust her restaurant recommendations implicitly." Richard made a sound that might have been a whimper. "I'm also planning to contact the health department about those interesting storage practices I observed in your kitchen during my recent night shifts as part of your cleaning crew. Did you know that improperly stored seafood can result in immediate closure orders? The photographs I took should be quite illuminating." Emma paused at his chair, looking down at the man who had reduced her daughter to tears, who had made her son ask if they were too poor to eat in a restaurant. "But mostly, Mr. Blackwood, I want you to remember something very important. The next time you decide that someone isn't good enough for your establishment, the next time you feel tempted to crush a child's dreams because their clothes aren't expensive enough, I want you to think about tonight. I want you to remember that you never know who you're talking to, and that sometimes the person you dismiss as worthless has more power than you could ever imagine. She leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Richard could hear. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood, tell your daughter Sophia that the woman from McDonald's says happy birthday." Emma Rodriguez walked out of Henderson's fine dining with her head held high, leaving behind a man whose career would never recover from the lesson he had just received. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for a moment, thinking about her children sleeping peacefully at her sister's house, unaware that their mother had just won a war they didn't even know had been declared. 3 months later, Henderson's fine dining closed permanently. The health department violations, the social media firestorm orchestrated by Janet Morrison's viral blog post, and the financial instability that Emma had helped expose had combined to create a perfect storm of destruction. Richard Blackwood found new employment as a server at a family restaurant, where he was notable for being unusually kind to children and never, ever commenting on anyone's appearance or apparent financial status. Emma Rodriguez used the insurance settlement from her husband's abandoned business debts to open a small catering company specializing in children's birthday parties. Her motto, printed on every business card and advertisement, was simple: every child deserves to feel special. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when Sophia and Marcus were doing homework at their kitchen table, Emma would remember the look in Richard Blackwood's eyes when he realized exactly who she was. She would think about the power that comes from being underestimated, about the strength that develops when you have nothing left to lose, and about the absolute devastation that a determined mother can unleash on anyone foolish enough to make her children cry. Emma Rodriguez had learned something important that night. Sometimes the most effective revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about teaching someone a lesson so thorough and complete that they spend the rest of their lives making sure they never forget it. And judging by the reports she occasionally heard about Richard Blackwood's newfound humility in his new job, the lesson had been learned very well indeed.